Senator Abetz.
Thank you, Mr President. There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead. So spoke the Labor Party through its current leader to the Australian people just days before the last election. At a time when the polls were perilously close, they were tight, Labor, its leader and deputy leader, solemnly promised the Australian people there would be no carbon tax. Suggestions that there would be were dismissed by Labor as hysterical. So nothing could be clearer. Labor sought and obtained a mandate from the Australian people not to impose a carbon tax. The fact that we are debating this 1.5 reams of legislation, 18 or 19 bills, to impose a carbon tax is the legislative proof of Labor's deceit and of Labor's contempt for the Australian people. These bills, if they are turned into acts, should they pass this place, will be 19 separate acts of deceit, 19 separate acts of betrayal, 19 separate acts signifying the contempt in which Labor holds the Australian people. Every single Labor member of the other place and every single Labor senator elected at the last election were elected on the clear promise of no carbon tax. They were, in fairness, however, elected on a promise to see if a community consensus could be built around a carbon price. Here, Labor has succeeded, and spectacularly so. A consensus has been developed, and a very strong one. A consensus to which Labor and Ms Gillard should lay personal claim, because but for their advocacy, the consensus would not be as strong as it is today. But alas for Labor, the clear, the strong, the overwhelming consensus on a carbon price is a consensus in opposition. The Australian people don't want a carbon tax. Despite spending millions of dollars of Australian taxpayers' money in a desperate advertising campaign, despite Labor funding its carbon tax cheer groups in the community, despite setting up their propaganda unit in Mr Combay's office, the consensus Labor has established in the Australian community is an overwhelming consensus against the carbon tax. And this overwhelming consensus against this destructive and corrosive tax is built on three factors. One, the blatant deceit of the electorate by Labor, the fact that it's bad policy, and thirdly, that the carbon tax will do nothing for the environment. As this Senate embarks on the second reading debate of the Orwellianly named Clean Energy Package, Australians know it is a package based on deceit, a package based on a dirty deal. So rather than debating the Clean Energy Package, we should in fact be renaming it the Dirty Deal Package, because it was struck with a dirty deal with the Australian Greens, a party incidentally led by a person who advocated for coal-fired power stations in his opposition to renewable, environmentally friendly hydro generation. It was this month, 30 years ago, Dr Brown was advocating coal-fired thermal power generation as, and let me quote, the best centralised option we have, end of quote, and, quote, manifestly better, end of quote, than more dams for Tasmania. Oh, what a visionary thinker. But consistency, integrity and robustness of thought have never been this de facto Prime Minister's strong suit. Now, why the ALP would listen to the Greens' policy prognosis and prescription after a three-decade record littered with policy failures is emblematic of how the Labor Party, the Australian Labor Party, has lost its way. But as the proverb so correctly tells us, if you don't believe in something, you'll fall for anything. And the worst 21st century exemplar of that proverb is the hapless Australian Labor Party of today. An ALP whose light on the hill is no longer powered by reliable baseload traditional Labor thought, but by the faltering and flickering transitory trendy fads, changing it from a once strong clear beam to a pale, intermittent, slowly dying ember. The ALP have not only lost the moral compass, they have lost their policy map as well. And that is why it should not surprise that Labor has served up this policy mishmash which will increase the cost of living, tighten the throttle even further around the throat of our farmers and small businesses, and reduce our manufacturing sector's capacity to compete with imports, let alone in overseas markets, not to mention the destructive impact on our volunteer sector and the disability sector. The carbon tax will impact every endeavour of human life, from our power bills to our grocery bills to our rates. The cost of running schools, hospitals, aged care facilities and prisons will all rise. Volunteering will become more expensive. As everyone is impacted, so everyone will pay. And that is why, on sober reflection, countries that were previously preparing to go down this route have accepted the wisdom of what the former Climate Change Minister, Senator Wong, said about a carbon tax. It was, she said, no magic bullet. She was right then, she remains right today. She is especially right in the absence of unified global action. But here she will be in this chamber, compounding her party's deceit on the electorate by trying to explain away what everybody knows to be true: the carbon tax is no solution. As the Green Labor government foolishly and recklessly rushes to create this toxic tax, they tell us countries all around the world are moving just as quickly. I've got to concede they are right. Countries are moving just as quickly, but Labor haven't noticed. They're moving in the opposite direction. A quick perusal of international headlines just this month shows the unmistakable trend. And the first one I refer to, of course, is from the Foreign Minister of Canada at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting just last week, when specifically asked whether Canada would be introducing a similar regime. It was a one-word, two-letter answer. Have a guess what it was? No. Absolute no. Now, if we needed a country to compare ourselves with, population-wise, a federation, resource-based, etc., the closest country in the world that we would identify with is Canada. They have deliberately said no to a carbon tax. Japan, they have indefinitely postponed theirs. The European scheme, which, might I add, is only 10% of the proposed Australian level, is facing collapse, whilst Europe is fully reconsidering its position. The United Kingdom is reducing its green energy subsidies. New Zealand is winding their scheme back. Russia taking no further action. France saying no. South Korea delaying. The list is ever growing. In the United States, they're not proceeding. President Obama has said so. But even in the United States, individual states are repealing their carbon tax type laws, such as New Hampshire, as are the provinces in Canada, such as Ontario. And of course, going back to the United States, the Chicago emissions trading scheme has collapsed. Even Spain, once heralded as the future, along with California, is slashing by 40% its wind power subsidies. So let's not have this deceptive nonsense that we must act now or we will be left behind. The world is moving in the opposite direction. If this tax is legislated, we will be the only country in the world with an economy-wide carbon tax with the highest rate. The indecent haste to get this legislation through is simply based on Labor needing to feed its insatiable vanity. If we wind back and recall the discredited and defunct carbon pollution reduction scheme, we might learn a few lessons. It was urgently needed, we were told, because it was the greatest moral challenge of our time, and the world couldn't afford to be denied the huge environmental benefit that a 5% reduction on our 1.5% global emissions would make. The hyperbole was flowing thick and fast. Of course, the real reason for the urgency at that time was the desire for Labor to be the performing clowns of Copenhagen and wave their legislation at an international forum and say, how clever are we? Now, 2 years later, the torrent of hyperbole is thankfully absent, but the excuse today has changed to business needs certainty. Well, business I speak with tell me they prefer the uncertainty of life rather than the certainty of what death has to offer. Of course, the urgency has nothing to do with Labor's newfound concern for business certainty. Indeed, if they were concerned about business certainty, they would not have broken their solemn promise that there would be no carbon tax. So if that was their main concern, they would not be going down this route at all. So once again we find it is the pathetic law of another international conference at which Labor wants to be, this time, the world's performing dunces of Durban. Our nation was saved from Labor's desire for international humiliation once. Let's hope we can be saved again. The feedback I receive is of a world community looking on in disbelief as Australia prepares to inflict unilateral economic self-pain on itself for no environmental gain, in the hope someone might stop to admire and notice. Let's be clear. Those that may stop to admire will be those with whom we compete internationally. The first ones, I'm sure, will be Canada. The next one, I'm sure, will be the United States, New Zealand, Japan, and the list goes on. If this government were genuinely concerned about the world environment, they would have a few other options available to them. Very easy options. They could be selling uranium to India. That would make a bigger dent in carbon dioxide emissions than the carbon tax in Australia, just by that one decision. They would be expanding and encouraging Australia's native forestry, thus slowing the rate of forest destruction in other parts of the world. They would accept native forest wood waste as biomass for renewable energy. And of course, they would be seeking to do something about Australia's shrinking forest plantations. But instead, this is the government that brought us pink bats and cash for clunkers, all in the name of the environment. Being rightly emboldened by the runaway success of pink bats and cash for clunkers, they now bring us this forest of legislation in the name of the environment. So let's ask, and this is what Labor needs to respond to, let's ask, what will this legislation do for the environment? By how much will world temperature decrease, and when? How much will sea levels be reduced? How much lower will sea levels be, and when? I suspect Australians would be willing to suffer some economic pain for environmental gain. But the reality is that as our economy becomes less efficient under a carbon tax and prices itself out of world markets, those economies without a carbon tax with even greater levels of pollution than Australia will simply have their production substituted for ours, with the resultant effect of even greater carbon emissions into the world's atmosphere. It is exactly this experience that is making Europe reconsider its stance on carbon pricing. I don't ask rhetorically, Madam Acting Deputy President, where have all the European aluminium smelters gone? Not to wind power, not to solar panels. They've actually gone offshore to Africa and elsewhere. And the environmental standards there? Undoubtedly a lot better than they previously were in Europe. But that is the message that Labor is trying to sell us. So the world's environment suffers further at the behest of those who put blind zealotry ahead of sound, evidence-based public policy. It is reminiscent of a person who preferred coal power over hydropower some 30 years ago. But let's ask the question, what would a 5% reduction now do in relation to the world's environment? Professor Graham Farquhar of the Australian National University Climate Change Institute is quoted as follows: "The aim of the carbon tax is to reduce Australian emissions by 5%. In turn, the aim of that reduction is to put political or economic pressure to encourage or shame other countries to reduce their emissions by 5%. If we are successful and all the countries of the world reduce their emissions to 5% below what they would have been, then the anthropogenic climate that we would otherwise have seen in 2031 will be postponed until when? 2032, 12 months later. That has to be part of the context of this debate. Labor's whole carbon tax deceit is compounded by other deceits. The Treasury modelling is all based on other countries following Australia's suit. Well, the list of countries I have read out indicates that the world is moving in the opposite direction to Australia. And so what they're doing is compounding their lie with erroneous modelling to suggest an outcome which, of course, is false. We then have the other example that we will have a lot of green jobs. All the world's studies have shown that for every green job created, there is a huge taxpayer subsidy to it, and about 2 or 3 mainstream jobs suffer and fall by the wayside. As a result, there is a net loss of jobs. Now, let's just go to some of the impacts of this legislation on everyday Australians. And one of the great sufferers will in fact be the single income families of Australia, part of Labor's social engineering. But the reason that the Labor Party deceived the electorate about this is that they know this is a toxic tax, they know it is bad policy, and they know they could not sell it to the Australian people. Why? Because it will be a $9 billion per annum tax. It will increase power bills by 10%. It will increase gas bills by 9%, and that is on Labor's own assessments. There will be higher marginal tax rates. There will be a huge impact on single-income families. 280,000 self-funded retirees will be worse off. And so, Madam Acting Deputy President, as we analyse this legislation, we see it was built on a deceit. It is now being compounded by shonky and flawed modelling based on the suggestion that the rest of the world is following, and it is also based on the assumption that somehow this will do something beneficial to the world environment. As we have pointed out, this legislation will in fact make the world's environment worse, cost Australians their standard of living, destroy jobs and be of no benefit. So why, with Labor knowing this, are they doing what they are doing? I think the Prime Minister may have been right when she said there will be no carbon tax under a government I lead, because it is the Australian Greens under Senator Brown that is actually leading this government.